Egypt, 1997. Part 1. The Shadows Gather. The desert of Sinai stretched out endlessly in all directions, a vast ocean of golden sand and jagged rocks under the relentless sun. In this arid wilderness, life clung to small, isolated villages like Al-Khaleh, where a handful of Christian families had found solace and community. For generations, they had lived in peace, despite the harshness of the desert, drawing strength from their faith and from each other. But now, even the unyielding silence of the desert couldn't mask the growing tension in the air. Fear had begun to creep into their lives like an unwelcome intruder. Youssef, the village pastor, was a man marked by years of dedication and quiet resilience. At 65, his face bore the weathered lines of both the desert winds and the countless prayers he had offered for his people. His eyes, dark and intense, held a wisdom earned through years of guiding his flock. His once strong shoulders were now slightly hunched, yet there remained an undeniable strength in the way he carried himself, a testament to the faith that had shaped his life. Each evening, after the village had settled into the calm of night, Youssef would retreat to the small stone church that stood at the heart of Al-Khaleh. The church was a modest building, its walls worn by decades of wind and sand, but within its simple confines, it held the soul of the community. The walls were adorned with hand-carved crosses, and a single oil lamp flickered near the altar, casting long shadows across the worn wooden pews. On this particular evening, the air inside the church was still, heavy with an unspoken sense of dread. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint echoes of distant rumors of violence, of extremism creeping ever closer. Youssef had heard the whispers from traveling merchants, tales of attacks on Christian villages far from Sinai, but close enough to plant the seeds of fear. As a leader, he knew it was his duty to remain calm, to offer reassurance to his people, but deep down, a gnawing anxiety had begun to take root in his heart. Kneeling at the altar, Youssef clasped his hands tightly, his knuckles white with the intensity of his prayer. His voice, usually steady and sure, now trembled ever so slightly as he whispered into the quiet night. "Lord, give me strength," he murmured. "Guide me, for I do not know how to protect them." The silence that followed his prayer was profound, as though the very walls of the church were listening. Youssef remained still, his eyes closed, waiting for the peace that usually followed his nightly conversations with God. But this time, there was no immediate comfort. Instead, a strange sensation began to stir within him, an overwhelming sense of anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. And then it happened. At first, it was subtle, like a distant glimmer on the horizon. But as Youssef opened his eyes, he saw it clearly. A column of light, impossibly bright, shimmered at the far end of the church. It was unlike anything he had ever witnessed, pure, radiant, and otherworldly. The light was not harsh. It was warm, inviting, as though it were a beacon calling out to him. Youssef blinked, certain his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He had spent many nights in this church, and never had he seen anything like this. Yet, the light remained, unwavering. As he gazed at it, a gentle voice, soft yet powerful, filled the room, though no one else was there to speak. It was not a sound that could be heard with ears alone. It resonated deep within his soul. "You must lead them," the voice said. "Take them from this place, for danger is coming." Youssef's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded as the voice continued, calm but insistent. "Do not doubt, Youssef. There is no time. You must gather your people and lead them to safety." As quickly as it had appeared, the light began to fade, leaving Youssef kneeling in the familiar darkness of the church, his mind racing. His hands shook as he raised them to his face, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He had heard the voice of God before in moments of quiet reflection, but never like this, never so direct, so urgent. His immediate reaction was disbelief. Surely, he thought, this was a vision brought on by fatigue or the weight of the world pressing down on him. He was an old man after all. Perhaps his mind was playing tricks on him, creating illusions out of his deepest fears. But deep down, he knew this was no illusion. The warmth of the light still lingered in his chest, and the words echoed in his mind with undeniable clarity. You must lead them. Rising to his feet, Yusef paced the length of the church, his sandals scuffing against the stone floor. The gravity of the situation pressed down on him with each step. How could he convince his people to leave? These families had lived in Al-Khaleh for generations. It was not just their home, it was their life, their identity. Asking them to leave would be like tearing the very fabric of their existence apart. And yet, he couldn't ignore the vision. The voice had been clear. Danger was coming. The distant rumors of attacks no longer felt distant. They were a storm on the horizon, and if they stayed, they would be swallowed by it. Still, doubt gnawed at him. Would the others even believe him? Would they trust in the visions of an aging pastor who claimed to have seen a column of light in the dead of night? He knew how fragile their trust could be, especially in times of fear. But he also knew that if he did nothing, the consequences could be far worse. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the narrow windows of the church, Yusef made his decision. He would not stay silent. God had spoken to him, and he could not turn away from that truth. He would gather the elders, share what he had seen, and trust in their faith. For better or worse, he had been chosen to lead, and lead he would. Before leaving the church, Yusef knelt one last time before the altar. His prayer was simple, yet filled with the weight of everything that was to come. Lord, if this is your will, give me the strength to follow it. Guide me, and guide my people, for we are in your hands. With that, he rose and stepped out into the blinding light of the morning sun, the warmth of the desert day beginning to wash over the village. His heart was heavy with the task ahead, but his steps were steady. There was no room for doubt anymore. The shadows were gathering, but so too was the light. Part 2. The Reluctant Flock. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the sleepy village of Al-Khaleh. The day began like any other, with the sounds of livestock stirring and the soft chatter of women preparing for the morning's chores. Yet an unsettling tension lingered in the air, unnoticed by most. In the village square, a cluster of men and women gathered, drawn together by an urgent summons from their pastor, Yusef. They had never been called together so early, and the unusual meeting stirred a sense of unease among them. Yusef stood in the middle of the square, the weight of the night's vision still pressing heavily on his chest. His eyes scanned the faces of the villagers, some familiar, others new, but all of them bound by the shared struggles of life in the desert. His heart ached, knowing that the message he was about to deliver would not be easy for them to hear, much less accept. Among those gathered were the village elders, individuals whose wisdom and influence had shaped the community for years. Nura, a strong-willed woman in her late 60s with silver streaks in her dark hair, stood near the front, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched Yusef with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Her sharp eyes had seen many seasons in Al-Khaleh, and she was not one to be easily swayed by visions or dreams. Beside her stood Khalid, a man of few words, but with a presence that commanded respect. His broad shoulders and weathered hands told the story of a life spent working the unforgiving desert soil. Yusef's voice broke the morning stillness. "My friends," he began, his tone calm, but filled with an urgency that caught the attention of everyone present. "I have gathered you here because I must share something with you, something that cannot wait." The villagers murmured among themselves, uneasy but curious. Yusef's eyes lingered on the small group of children playing nearby, their laughter a stark contrast to the heaviness of what he was about to say. He took a deep breath, the memory of the column of light burning in his mind like a fire that refused to be extinguished. "Last night, during my prayers, I was given a vision," he continued, his voice growing steadier. "I saw a column of light, bright and unmistakable, and I heard a voice, God's voice. He spoke to me, warning of danger approaching. He told me to lead our community away from this place, to leave before it's too late. The square fell silent. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the palm trees and the occasional bleat of a goat. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the whispers began, soft at first, like the stirring of leaves, but soon growing louder as the gravity of Yusef's words settled over the crowd. Noura was the first to speak, her voice steady but filled with skepticism. Yusef, we have heard many stories, many rumors of trouble, but we have lived here for generations. Our fathers and their fathers before them built this village with their hands. How can we abandon it because of a dream? Her words echoed the thoughts of many in the crowd. Al-Khaleh had been their home for as long as anyone could remember. The houses, small and modest, were built from the very earth that surrounded them. Every stone, every wooden beam had been placed with care, with the intention of lasting a lifetime. To leave now, to walk away from the only place they had ever known, seemed impossible. Yusef had expected this reaction, yet it didn't make the task any easier. I understand your hesitation, he said, his voice softening. This land is sacred to us, but this is not about abandoning our home. It is about protecting our lives. The danger is real, Noura. I felt it in my soul, and I know God has spoken to me. Khalid stepped forward, his brow furrowed in thought. We have heard of attacks in other villages, yes, but those are far from here. Al-Khaleh has always been safe. We are hidden in the desert, far from the troubles of the cities. Why would anyone come for us? Yusef turned to Khalid, recognizing the truth in his words. Al-Khaleh had indeed been spared from much of the conflict that had plagued other regions. Their isolation had been both a blessing and a curse, protected from outsiders, but also far removed from any hope of help should trouble come. But the vision had been clear. Trouble was coming, and it would not spare them simply because they were hidden. The attacks may seem far away now, Yusef replied, but they are coming closer every day. We cannot rely on our isolation to keep us safe any longer. We must trust in God's guidance. He is showing us a way out, a way to survive. If we stay, we risk losing everything. Despite his conviction, the crowd remained uncertain. Some nodded in quiet agreement, while others exchanged glances filled with doubt. The fear of the unknown was powerful, and Yusef could see it written on their faces. These were people who had faced the harshness of the desert and survived. They had endured droughts, storms, and the scorching heat of the Sinai sun. But now they were being asked to leave the land they had fought so hard to hold on to, and that was a difficult thing to accept. Yusef's heart sank. He had hoped his words would be enough to convince them, but he could see that fear and doubt still held them captive. He could not force them to follow him. Faith could not be commanded. It had to come from within, from a place of trust and belief in something greater than themselves. I cannot make this decision for you, Yusef said finally, his voice tinged with sadness. But I must do what I believe is right. I will not stand by and watch our community fall into danger. I ask you to pray on this, to seek guidance from God. He will show you the way, just as he has shown me. With that, Yusef turned and began to walk away, his heart heavy with the weight of their indecision. He had done all he could, but now it was up to them. As he left the square, the villagers remained behind, their conversations hushed and uncertain. The fear of leaving their homes warred with the fear of the unknown danger that Yusef had spoken of. That night, the village was quieter than usual. Families gathered in their homes, speaking in low voices about what had been said. Some were angry, accusing Yusef of stirring fear where there was none. Others were more contemplative, their minds troubled by the possibility that he might be right. Yusef, alone in the small stone church once more, knelt before the altar, his heart aching for the people he had tried to protect. He prayed fervently, pleading with God to open their hearts, to help them see the truth before it was too late. The image of the column of light still burned brightly in his mind, but now it was accompanied by the faces of those he feared would be left behind if they did not listen. Lord, give them the strength to trust in you, Yusef whispered, his voice breaking. Guide them as you have guided me. The night passed slowly, and as dawn approached, the village remained undecided. Some, like Nura and Khalid, still questioned the need to leave. Others began to prepare, quietly packing what few belongings they could carry, uncertain but unwilling to ignore the warning. Yusuf could only hope that when the time came, they would make the choice to follow. Part 3. The Exodus begins. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, haunting shadows across the village as the first brave few began to gather at the outskirts of Al-Khaleh. The oppressive heat of the day had started to wane, but the desert still radiated warmth from the sand beneath their feet. The small group that had agreed to follow Yusuf stood nervously, clutching their meager belongings. They were hesitant, their eyes filled with uncertainty and fear, but the memory of Yusuf's urgent warning weighed heavily on their hearts. Despite their doubts, they had chosen to trust in the vision, however unclear it might seem to them. Yusuf stood at the front of the group, his face resolute but etched with concern. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that many had chosen to stay behind. The village, the only home they had ever known, still held on to its people, its history and its memories anchoring them. But for those who had gathered here now, their faith in something greater had propelled them forward. He looked over the small crowd, fewer than he had hoped for, but still, they were here. Among them was Nura, her usually strong and composed demeanor now softened by a deep worry. Her sharp eyes, which had once looked at Yusuf with skepticism, now held a flicker of trust. Beside her stood her younger brother, Ahmed, a man in his 30s with a young wife and 2 small children. They had been one of the last families to agree to leave, torn between the safety of the familiar and the unknown risks of the desert. Ahmed's wife, Layla, held their youngest tightly in her arms, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion and fear, while their older child clutched the edge of her robes, eyes wide with uncertainty. Farouk, the village's eldest man, had also come, his face lined not only with age, but with decades of hardship endured in this unforgiving land. His gait was slow and labored, but his spirit remained unbroken. Though his legs ached and his back stooped under the weight of his years, his faith in Yusuf's vision had convinced him to leave the village he had called home for over 70 years. He carried little with him, save for a small, hand-carved wooden cross that had belonged to his wife, now passed. His fingers clutched it as though it were his lifeline. The small band of villagers stood in silence, their eyes occasionally glancing back toward the village they were about to leave behind. The fading sunlight gave Al-Khaleh an almost peaceful glow, but beneath the serenity, they all knew something dark was looming. Yusuf took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him once again. He had never imagined that one day he would lead his people into the unknown, away from everything they had built together. Yet here they stood, a small group united by faith, preparing to walk into the heart of the desert. He knew there was no turning back now. The moment was thick with hesitation. The path before them was uncertain, but Yusuf could feel the urgency deep in his bones. The column of light had appeared to him night after night, a divine sign that their only hope lay in leaving before it was too late. He looked to the horizon, where the sun had nearly disappeared, casting a faint purple glow across the sky. The desert stretched out endlessly before them, a vast and unforgiving wilderness that seemed to swallow the light whole. As the villagers murmured among themselves, voices low and anxious, Yusuf felt a familiar warmth in his chest. It started slowly, like the embers of a fire reigniting, and then it grew, brighter, hotter, until it filled him with a sense of certainty. And then, as if on cue, the light appeared once more. It began as a distant glow on the horizon, barely noticeable at first, like the last remnants of the setting sun. But as Yusuf watched, it grew stronger, more vivid, until it took shape, an unmistakable pillar of light, rising up from the earth and stretching toward the heavens. It shimmered in the twilight, casting a soft, ethereal glow over the desert sands. Gasps of awe and fear escaped the lips of the villagers. Nura took a step back, her hand covering her mouth as she stared at the spectacle before them. Ahmed tightened his grip on Layla's hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. Even Farouk, whose years had left him unshaken by many things, gazed at the light with a mixture of wonder and reverence. "The light," someone whispered. "It's real." Youssef stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, but not with fear. This time, it was with conviction. He raised his hand, pointing toward the column of light that now illuminated the path ahead. "This is what I saw," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "This is the sign I was given. It is our path to safety. God has not abandoned us." The villagers remained frozen for a moment, torn between awe and fear. But Youssef could see the shift in their faces. Slowly, faith began to replace doubt. They had seen the light, and with it, the divine confirmation they had needed. "We follow the light," Youssef said softly, more to himself than to the others. Then, louder, with more confidence, he repeated, "We follow the light." And so they did. The group began their journey, leaving behind the village of Al-Khaleh as nightfall descended over the desert. The air had grown cooler, and the sound of their footsteps was muffled by the soft sands beneath them. The column of light hovered in the distance, guiding their every step, unwavering in its brilliance. As they walked, the silence of the desert seemed to amplify their thoughts. Each person carried their own burdens, memories of the life they had known, the homes they had built, the people they had left behind. For many, the decision to follow Youssef had not come easily. Even now, doubts lingered in their minds like shadows clinging to the edges of their faith. But with every step they took, the light grew brighter, and with it a sense of purpose. For Noura, the journey felt like the breaking of chains she had worn for years. Her skepticism had always been her shield, protecting her from disappointment, from the fear of hope. But now, as she walked with her brother and his family by her side, she felt something inside her begin to soften. She glanced at Youssef, walking steadily ahead of them, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe. Layla, her arms aching from holding her youngest child, kept her gaze on the light. Every step felt like a test of endurance, but she held on to the hope that this journey would lead them to safety. Her husband, Ahmed, walked beside her, his hand on her back, offering silent comfort. Their future was uncertain, but together, they held on to the promise that the light represented something greater than fear. Farouk, ever the silent observer, walked with the calmness of a man who had seen many things in his lifetime. The desert was no stranger to him, and yet tonight, it felt different. The air was charged with something he couldn't quite explain, a sense of destiny, of being part of something far bigger than the village they had left behind. He clutched his wooden cross tightly, murmuring prayers under his breath as he followed the column of light. Hours passed, the night growing deeper as they ventured further into the wilderness. The column of light remained steadfast, never wavering, guiding them like a beacon in the dark. Occasionally, Youssef glanced back at his people, their weary faces illuminated by the soft glow. He could see the fatigue in their eyes, the weight of uncertainty pulling at them. But he also saw something else, faith. They were beginning to trust, to believe in the path ahead. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting a silver glow over the desert, Youssef felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The fear and doubt that had once plagued him were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence in the divine guidance that had brought them here. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but with the light to guide them, they would find their way. And so, they pressed on, deeper into the desert, leaving the past behind. Part 4. The Attack. The night sky above the Sinai desert was vast and starless, its inky blackness stretching endlessly in all directions. The cool wind had picked up, swirling sand across the dunes in soft waves, and the small group of villagers trudged forward, the column of light still guiding their every step. They had been walking for hours now, the darkness thickening around them, but the light remained steady, a constant beacon in the otherwise unforgiving wilderness. Youssef led the group, his eyes fixed on the glowing pillar ahead. His feet ached, the weight of his years pressing down on him, but he pushed forward, driven by the vision that had led them to this point. Behind him, the villagers walked in silence, their faces etched with fatigue and doubt, but also with a growing sense of hope. The column of light, which had once seemed like an impossible dream, now felt real, tangible, a sign that they were on the right path. But the desert was a harsh and unforgiving place, and its stillness was deceptive. As they moved deeper into the dunes, the night seemed to grow colder, the wind sharper, and the sense of danger that had lingered at the edge of their minds began to press in on them. Every rustle of sand, every distant howl of the wind, felt like an omen, a reminder that they were not out of danger yet. Suddenly, the stillness of the night was broken by a distant sound, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to roll across the dunes like distant thunder. Yusef's heart skipped a beat as he stopped in his tracks, listening intently. The others slowed behind him, their eyes wide with fear, their breaths caught in their throats. The sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now, the sharp crack of gunfire. For a moment, panic surged through the group. Layla, who had been walking with her children in silence, clutched them tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. Ahmed placed a protective arm around his wife and children, his face pale. Noura's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, her breath quickening as the realization of what was happening settled over her. The attack had begun. Yusef's hands trembled as the noise echoed through the desert, the sound of violence drawing ever nearer. His mind raced, torn between fear and a deep, unwavering faith in the vision that had brought them here. He had been certain that the column of light was leading them to safety, but now, with the unmistakable sounds of gunfire in the distance, doubt clawed at him once again. Had they left too late? Was it already too late to save them? The villagers stood frozen, their faces pale and filled with terror as the reality of their situation set in. Al-Khaleh was under attack, the very thing Yusef had feared most. The distant rumble of destruction, the terrifying truth that they had escaped only by the grace of God, was now playing out in the village they had called home. The homes they had built with their own hands were being torn apart. Lives they had known for generations were being destroyed in an instant. Those who had stayed behind, friends, neighbors, loved ones, were now in mortal danger. Tears welled in the eyes of many as they realized what had happened. Farouk, the village elder who had walked so silently through the desert, now stood with tears streaming down his weathered face. His hand clutched his wife's wooden cross, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. His heart ached for those who had stayed behind, for the friends he would likely never see again. He had trusted in the vision, but the pain of loss was still sharp, like a blade cutting deep into his soul. Layla sobbed quietly, holding her children close to her chest, her heart breaking for the lives lost in Al-Khaleh. She had questioned whether leaving was the right choice, but now, with the gunfire echoing in her ears, she knew that they had narrowly escaped death. The weight of that realization pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. Yusef, sensing the panic growing within the group, took a deep breath and forced himself to remain calm. He could not allow fear to take over. Not now. They had come too far, and they were too close to safety to let terror consume them. The light had not led them astray. It had saved them. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice firm but gentle, carrying over the wind. "God has protected us. We have been spared. We must keep moving." The villagers looked to him, their faces still pale with fear, but there was a glimmer of trust in their eyes. Yusef's words, though simple, brought a measure of comfort to their shaken hearts. They had made it this far, perhaps they could make it the rest of the way. As they continued their journey, the sounds of the attack grew fainter, the violence of the world they had left behind fading into the distance. But the emotional toll weighed heavily on them. Every step felt heavier now, burdened by the knowledge of what had happened to those they had left behind. The villagers walked in silence, their hearts heavy with grief and guilt. Yusef, though racked with sorrow for the loss of Al-Khaleh, knew he had to remain strong. He could not afford to let his own doubts or emotions cloud his judgment. They had been saved for a reason, and he had to lead them to safety. He cast his gaze forward, toward the column of light that still shone brightly in the distance. It had not wavered, not once, and neither would he. The night stretched on, the desert vast and unrelenting. The villagers moved as one, their footsteps slow and weary but determined. The column of light was their only guide, a promise that there was something beyond the darkness, something that would save them from the destruction they had narrowly escaped. And though their hearts ached, they pressed on, driven by the hope that had brought them this far. As they climbed over a particularly high dune, Yusef paused, his breath catching in his throat. In the distance, nestled between the dunes, was something unexpected, an oasis. The soft glow of the moonlight reflected off a small pool of water, surrounded by palm trees that swayed gently in the cool night breeze. It was as though the desert itself had opened up, offering them a refuge. Yusef felt a surge of relief wash over him. The light had brought them here, to safety, to a place where they could rest and recover. He turned to the group, his face filled with quiet awe. "This is it," he whispered. "We are safe." The villagers, exhausted and broken from the journey, looked out at the oasis with disbelief. For a moment, there was silence as they took in the sight before them. Then, slowly, a murmur of relief spread through the group. Tears flowed freely now, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were tears of gratitude, of hope. One by one, they began to move toward the oasis, their steps lighter now. Layla let out a sob of relief as she dipped her hand into the cool water, her children splashing beside her. Farouk knelt at the edge of the pool, his hands cupping the water as he muttered a prayer of thanks. Noura stood by her brother, her eyes filled with wonder at the sight before her. Even she, who had doubted for so long, could not deny the miracle they had witnessed. Yusef stood at the edge of the group, watching as his people drank from the water and found peace in the shade of the palms. His heart swelled with gratitude, not only for their survival, but for the faith that had brought them here. He knew their journey was not over, but for now, they were safe. The light had led them through the darkness, and it would continue to guide them forward. Part 5. A New Sun. The first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the small oasis where the villagers of Al-Khaleh had found refuge. The desert, which had once seemed so vast and threatening, now felt like a distant memory. In its place was the gentle trickle of water, the rustling of palm leaves swaying in the breeze, and the soft murmur of voices as the villagers stirred from a night of much-needed rest. For the first time in days, they awoke without fear. Their journey had been long and filled with uncertainty, but now, as they gathered near the pool of fresh water that had sustained them, a quiet peace settled over them. The column of light that had guided them through the darkened desert had faded with the rising sun, but its memory remained vivid in their minds. They had seen a miracle, and with it came the realization that they had been saved for a purpose. Yusef sat apart from the group, his weary body propped against a smooth stone at the edge of the oasis. His eyes, tired but filled with a quiet sense of satisfaction, gazed out at his people. They had made it. He had led them away from destruction, and now they were safe. The weight of responsibility that had pressed on him so heavily throughout their journey began to lift, leaving in its place a deep sense of gratitude. He watched as Layla played with her children, the laughter of the little ones ringing through the air like music. She had been so burdened with fear when they had left the village, but now her face shone with relief and hope. Ahmed sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his eyes closed as if in silent prayer. Nearby, Noura knelt beside the water's edge, her reflection rippling in the pool as she cupped her hands to drink. Her sharp, skeptical gaze had softened, and she seemed lost in thought, her eyes filled with something Yusef had not seen in her before, faith. Farouk, the eldest among them, sat in the shade of a palm tree, his frail hands clasping his wife's wooden cross as he murmured a quiet prayer. His old bones ached from the journey, but his spirit was strong. He had lived through more than most, and now, in this moment, he felt a deep connection to the generations that had come before him. He had left behind everything he had ever known, But as he looked around at the faces of his fellow villagers, he knew that they had gained something far more valuable: hope. As the morning wore on, the group began to gather near the center of the oasis. The tension that had once hung over them like a dark cloud had lifted, replaced by an air of quiet gratitude. There were no grand celebrations, no joyous exclamations, just the simple, profound relief of having survived. But beneath that relief was something more. It was the realization that they had been guided, protected, and led to this place by something far greater than themselves. Yusef stood, his joints protesting the movement after so many days of walking, and made his way toward the group. His people turned to him as he approached, their eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and quiet reverence. He had led them through the darkest days of their lives, and now they looked to him for guidance once more. But Yusef was not the man he had been before. The fear and doubt that had once plagued him were gone, replaced by a deep and unshakable faith. He had seen the power of God's hand guiding them through the desert, and he knew that the same power would guide them forward into the unknown future. "My friends," Yusef began, his voice steady and calm, "we have been through much together. We have faced fear, uncertainty, and loss. But we have also been shown the light of God's protection. We have seen his hand guiding us, leading us away from destruction and into this place of safety." The villagers nodded, their eyes fixed on him as he spoke. For the first time in days, there was no hesitation, no doubt in their faces. They had all felt the power of what had happened. They had all seen the light. "This oasis is a gift," Yusef continued, "but it is not the end of our journey. We have been spared for a reason, and we must now decide what comes next. Our village may be gone, but our faith remains strong, and it is our faith that will lead us forward." Nura, who had been silent for much of the journey, stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Yusef. "You were right, Yusef," she said softly. "I doubted you, and I doubted the vision. But now I see. I see that God has been with us all along." Her words hung in the air, and Yusef could see the emotion in her eyes. It was not easy for Nura to admit her doubts, but the events of the past few days had shaken her deeply. She, like many others, had been transformed by what they had witnessed. Layla spoke next, her voice trembling with emotion. "We were so afraid, so lost," she said, her arms around her children. "But you showed us the way. God showed us the way." Yusef smiled, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "It was not I who showed the way," he replied. "It was God who led us here. I was merely his servant, following the path he set before us. And now, it is up to us to continue walking that path." There was a moment of silence as the group absorbed his words. The desert had tested them, had stripped them of everything they had known, but it had also given them something in return: a renewed faith, a deeper understanding of the power of God's will. Farouk, who had been quiet for much of the journey, raised his voice. "We must rebuild," he said, his voice firm despite his frail frame. "Our village may be gone, but we are not. We can rebuild. Perhaps not in Al-Khaleh, but here or somewhere new. God has given us the strength to survive. We must use that strength to build a new life." The villagers murmured in agreement, their faces brightening with the possibility of a new beginning. The weight of their loss was still heavy, but the hope of starting anew gave them something to hold on to. They had been spared for a reason, and now they would find that reason together. Yusef felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The burden of leading his people had been great, but now, as he stood among them, he knew that they were ready to take the next step on their journey. They had come through the desert together, and they would face whatever came next with the same strength and faith that had brought them this far. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm rays over the oasis, the villagers began to talk among themselves, making plans for the future. There was still much work to be done, but they were no longer afraid. The light that had guided them through the darkest night would continue to shine, leading them forward into a new chapter of their lives. Yusef looked out at the desert beyond the oasis, his heart filled with gratitude. He knew that their journey was far from over, But he also knew that they were no longer walking in darkness. The light had shown them the way, and as long as they kept their faith, it would continue to guide them. For the first time since they had left Al-Khaleh, Yusuf allowed himself to smile. The journey had been long, the losses great, but they had found their way. And in the end, it was not the village they had lost that mattered, but the faith they had gained. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.